Hello. In my black and white workflow, there are some basic tools that I use all the time in all my photographs. So I'm going to explain them a little bit more here in this part of the video. Before you can convert your color photos to black and white images, you need to make sure that you have a very good color image. So what I'm going to do here in Lightroom is to demonstrate some of the tools I use in Lightroom to come up with the optimized color image. So I'm going to Lightroom, I'm going to develop, and what I do at first is come up with the white balance correction. Usually I would click on auto white balance, and if that doesn't deliver the results that you had in mind, then you can come up with a manual white balance correction. But most of the times, if you would click on auto white balance, it would come up with the correct white balance settings. Well, in this case, I'm going to do it manually. So I'm going to, I think it's a little bit too blue, this image. So I'm going to, click on auto, and then I'm going to correct it manually. So adding a little bit more of the temperature so it doesn't look too blue. But blue in this case is good for me because I like a sky that's a little bit blue, so I can come up with a better black and white conversion afterwards. So this is the white balance corrections. What I'm going to do now is to come up with a crop. I always like to come up with a square crop in my work. So that is something that I'm going to handle right now. I always use the crop tool, and at the same time I'm going to crop guide overlay, and I always like to use the golden ratio grid. So that's something that I'm going to use for this one. You can also use let's say the rule of third grid, but I always prefer to use the golden ratio grid. So I'm going to come up with this grid. I'm going to one by one. So I'm going to the ratio settings, the aspect ratio settings, where you can choose from various formats. In this case, I'm choosing the 1:1 format, which is the square crop setting. But there are also lots of other formats available, but that doesn't apply to this situation. I'm going to go for the 1:1 square format. So what I do here is to make sure I have the right composition. So you can move a little bit with your mouse and with your square crop. But I like this image to be compositioned like such, with the midway line straight through the axis of the building. So it's something like this. So this is where you decide your crop, and I think I like this crop. Another thing that I like to do in Lightroom is to come up with some added details. So that's what I'm also going to do. I'm going to detail, and I always like to add a little bit of sharpening using the sharpening tool. In this case, I will go for an amount of, let's say, 32, something that I always use, a radius of 1/1.2, and a detail setting of 32 at the same time. So these are the basic settings I always use for all my images: 32, 1.2, and 32. So now I've added some details, and before I correct the perspective for this image, I'm also going to go for the auto tone setting. So I'm clicking on auto, so it changes the tones in your image. I think it's a little bit too much, so I'm going to correct it manually, like this. I would like to have a complete tonal range covering the histogram, so I'm going to add a little bit more contrast, a little bit more highlight, make it a little bit darker here. Okay. Well, This is something that comes close to my optimal color image. So the last thing that I'm going to do is to correct the perspective, and you can do that here in Lightroom as well. So I'm going to switch on the crop overlay again. Then you can go to the lens correction settings and just click on manual, and then you will see some settings that you can use to correct your perspective. Because if you would look closely at the image, then you will see that some lines, some vertical lines and some horizontal lines are a little bit off. So I try to correct that. And you can do that by clicking on constraint crops. That's something that I always do because I want to make sure that it still fits within the square crop. And what you have to do then is just play with the different various sliders. In this case, I think I need to play with the vertical slider to go with the vertical correction. See what happens when I play with this slider. I think it's somewhere around here. Just make sure that the vertical lines are perfectly straight, and the same goes for the horizontal lines. So you have to play with the horizontal sliders, something like this. Now the other way around, something like this. So what you see then, if you play with the horizontal slider, is that the perspective for the vertical lines is changing again. So you have to correct it again, more like this. Okay. So this is how you do that in Lightroom. It's very easy. You can play just with the horizontal and the vertical sliders to come up with a good perspective in your architectural images, which is of course very important for your architectural work. What I'm going to do now is to export this photo to my folder so I can import it again in Photoshop. I'm always going to export it as a TIFF file. I can demonstrate it here as well. So I'm going to export. What I do then is obviously choose the correct folder, and what I always do is that you export it as a TIFF file. So make sure that you have selected the TIFF file, not the JPEG file. Bit depth is at 16 bits, which is okay. Color space is Adobe RGB 1998, which is also okay. Make sure that your resolution is on 300 dpi. That's what I always use. And then you can start exporting the image. Well, so okay, after you've optimized your color image, then the next step will be the conversion of the color photograph to 3 basic black and white files. I'm going to do that using Silver Efex Pro 2 as a plugin in Photoshop. Now I have opened the original color photograph in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do now in Photoshop is come up with a black and white conversion of the original color photograph. But I'm going to do that in a little bit of a different way. And why I'm doing that, I'm going to explain it later on in a more detailed technical workflow. But basically, I'm going to create 3 different black and white conversions of one and the same color photograph. These 3 different conversions are a neutral black and white conversion, an overexposed black and white conversion, and an underexposed black and white conversion. So I'm going to do that using Nik software, Silver Efex Pro 2. So I'm going to Silver Efex Pro 2. So what you see here when you've opened Silver Efex Pro 2 is on the left-hand side, you can see all the presets. It consists of a neutral preset, an underexposed preset, and if you scroll a little bit further down, then you would see the overexposed preset. So I'm going to convert my color photograph to all these 3 versions. So I'm going to start with the neutral preset. So I'm going to create a neutral black and white conversion of that one. So I'm not going to play with the sliders at all, just come up with the very basic neutral black and white conversion. So that's what I do. Okay, then you have to save this one, and I usually save that as the name of the photograph, then with the add-on as black and white neutral. Well, so what I've done with the neutral conversion, you can do the same for the underexposed version and the overexposed version, and just save it in the same way. So that's that's the part for the black and white conversion, but before I finish this part off, I think I need to emphasize that I always like to use SilverFX Pro 2 because it's much more easier than trying to come up with the black and white conversion using Photoshop only. There are many other ways of creating black and white images using the Photoshop tools, using the built-in Photoshop tools. But I think if you purchase yourself a copy of SilverFX Pro 2, it's much more easy, it's much more convenient, and you can use the simple basic presets that comes with SilverFX Pro 2 to come up with a very decent black and white conversion. And it's all up to you. You can also use the Photoshop functions, but I prefer to use SilverFX Pro 2 to come up with the basic conversions that I will use later on in my more detailed technical workflow.